Super. So my name's Andrea Sharkey, and I'm the Ottawa MRIA chapter president. So I want to welcome you all to our event today, the Authenticity Paradox. We're really excited to see such a large group of people, a lot of faces that we haven't seen before. So thank you so much for taking the time to come out today. I expect and anticipate this is going to be a really interesting conversation, and I hope that you guys all take part by asking questions and just chatting more after as well. So I'd like to begin by also thanking our specific sponsor for this event, which has been Earnscliffe Strategic Group, and also they've been a big part of helping us organize this event and getting people on board and coming out. But I certainly also want to thank all of our sponsors that we've had for the 2016 season. And there's so many, I've written them all down so I don't forget anyone. We had a really great turnout of people and companies who have supported us over this 2016 year. So ECOS, TNS, ASDE, Environics, Research Now, Nielsen, Ipsos, Phoenix, Leger, MTM, Abacus Data, Chorus Consulting Group, and Elemental. So again, thank you to all of our sponsors for everything that you've done and for helping us to create great events, and we hope to continue to create more exciting events in the future. But for now, let's focus on this awesome event. So I'd like to introduce Doug Anderson, who is from Earnscliffe, and he's been instrumental in helping us to put this event together. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Doug, and he'll explain a little more about the event.
I don't think I've ever actually stood up at a podium with a beer on the podium before. Thanks very, very much for coming. As Andrea said, one of the things that we've been trying to do with the association, at least for the Ottawa chapter, is diversify who's been coming out to our groups. In the last few years, we found we were a little introverted, if you will, having lots of conversations within ourselves as an industry and market researchers and talking about those trends and, you know, our methodologies and such, and not maybe doing as good a job at reaching out to the broader community in Ottawa. People like you who use public opinion research, consume it, read about it, make informed decisions on the basis of it, and put together a topic that that might help you, you know, think a little bit more about whatever the issue is. In this particular case, it's a topic that is sort of an edutainment topic for me personally. Kind of a train wreck sometimes to watch how some of the opinion trends have formed, and how it is that people are coming to hold some views or support some positions that don't seem to necessarily fit with what you would expect they really want, or fit with what's going to produce the outcome that they want. And so one of the analogies that keeps popping into my head about what's been going on is the scene from Zoolander. I don't know if you remember that movie. Ben Stiller created this character who was a model, and he's a famous model because he's got these 3 looks. And I don't know if you remember it, but the 3 looks were all identical, right? And the whole movie, he spends his time trying to perfect that 4th one, Blue Steel. He's going to get it. And the climax of the movie, he gets it. But in the course of it, Will Ferrell's character, who was my favorite, Mugatu, suddenly interrupts things and is like, wait, everybody, it's the same look. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. And that, for me, is sort of what I've been feeling every once in a while when I see, it's like, how can you believe this? How can you accept this, adopt this? And some of the times, there's actually pretty solid reasons why people draw the conclusions that they draw, and we might disagree with them, but how they got there is actually more rational than it might appear on the surface if we disagree, for example, with what the position is. But some of them are more troubling. And the subtopic here, the subtitle of, is the public losing faith in experts, is, in some of the work that I've done, I think what I've seen as some of the troubling things where communicators are trying to get some fact across, and there's some crossfire that's interfering with the effectiveness of that, and it's causing outcomes that people don't really want to have happen. An example would be the outbreak of measles in Disneyland last year, attributed directly to a reduction in the number of parents in the area getting their kids vaccinated. Why are they not getting them vaccinated with the MMR vaccine? Because just enough of them are believing that there's a link between the vaccine and autism. And it's adherence to that and its impact on a behavior that then can possibly become problematic. And so if you're an expert in public health and you're trying to explain to people there isn't a link, and they're still believing in a study that was debunked 8 years ago or something, it's a frustrating communications endeavor. And so we have clients sometimes who want to talk about these things, and they're dealing with audiences who are not necessarily consuming the most valuable information and forming opinions. And the most obvious, I think, right now that we see every night in the news, if you're like me and addicted to watching it, is the American election. And if you were to write down a list of characteristics that voters want in the states, ask them to write down, the things that they would list might not actually fit with the person that a lot of them are backing. So Donald Trump has obviously lied, and he bullies, and there's all kinds of things that make for amazing Jon Stewart moments where you go, what? And yet, against what might be the most intellectual arsenal and the most financially backed opponent ever in a presidential election campaign, he's neck and neck. So how do we get to that? So we thought we would pull together some people who observe trends in attitudes and behaviors, and have the discussion led by Nancy Jameson. So let me take a moment to introduce Nancy. Nancy is, full disclosure, my sister-in-law. It's true. And Nancy has been public affairs, public policy, communications practitioner in Ottawa for decades. Has worked with Prime Minister Joe Clark, has worked with Ontario Premier Bill Davis, was involved in some of the most influential moments in Canadian history in the last 4 decades. Repatriating the Constitution, Meech Lake Accord, referendum, GST, if that's your thing. Nancy's been involved in that, and since 1985, she's been providing her services in the private sector as a strategic consultant and communications consultant in those areas, working on a wide variety of subject areas. And yes, we normally at the MRIA would get some sort of research geek to be the one who moderates the discussion, but we've actually kind of adopted Nancy. She has proven herself in the past as being someone who's more capable perhaps of counting than some of the colleagues that she was working with in the past. And I think a few of you might know that historic moment. You can ask her about it later. But for the moment, I will say, ladies and gentlemen, Nancy Jameson.
Guy. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for coming out this afternoon. Full disclosure on my part, it's not just that I have a brother-in-law who's a researcher. I sleep with a researcher every night, too. I'm married to one. I sleep with another one. So the other part of the conflict of interest that exists is that the three panelists are all old friends. The three of us have all been friends for a very long time, and as you can probably tell by the lack of makeup, probably too long. I'm going to start at the end with Alan Gregg. I think probably everyone in this room knows Alan. He's among Canada's most recognized and respected researchers and strategists. He's played a central role in dozens of election campaigns over the last 30 years and a number of public policy campaigns advocating for private sector clients. His unique talent, and he has many, is to develop research-based strategies and then translate them into all aspects of campaign management. As most of you probably know, he founded Decima Research in 1979, which is probably about 10 years after we met, which is really disturbing. He co-founded the Strategic Council in 1995 and was chair of Harris Decima from 2007 to 2014. And just to return full circle, he is now principal at Earnscliffe Strategy Group. Neil MacDonald, senior correspondent for the National CBC. He's currently based in Ottawa. Prior to that, he was CBC's Washington correspondent for 12 years, and before that, he spent 5 years reporting from the Middle East. He also had a previous career in newspapers. And it says right here he speaks English and French fluently and some Arabic, and I think if you press him hard, he can probably swear in all three of those languages. So. Susan Delacourt is a political columnist with Toronto Star and iPolitics. As you all know, she's worked in some of the top newsrooms in the country, from the Toronto Star and the Globe to the Ottawa Citizen and the National Post. She's the author of 4 books, including her latest, which I would urge you all to run out and buy, Shopping for Votes, and it was a finalist for the prestigious Western Writers' Trust Prize. She's a frequent political panelist on CBC Radio, Global, CTV, and she teaches classes in journalism and political communication at Carleton University. And she is actually probably the most impressive. Neil's just muttering very impressive. It's true. She really is very impressive. So these are our panelists. So welcome, everyone. Welcome, friends. And as Doug outlined, and you will have known from the materials you read, we're really here just to have an informal conversation about the role that facts and expertise plays in our current political discourse. I think, as most of us know, facts hold a really sort of sacred place in most Western liberal democracies. And whenever democracy seems to be going off the rails, and I might editorialize and say it seems to be doing so south of the border, when voters are manipulated, or when politicians duck, or when experts provide truths that are in fact closer to truthiness, we often turn to facts for our salvation. But they seem to be losing their ability to support any kind of consensus in our political discourse. Sure, most of you are probably familiar with the wonderful saying of the late Senator Daniel Moynihan, who said, "Everyone's entitled to his own opinions, but not to his own facts." And that might be true, but it seems increasingly that politicians and electorates and experts are concluding and constructing their own kind of alternate reality and their own set of facts. So I'd like to start with a question to Alan and then invite Neil and Susan to jump in if they'd like, which is to say, a number of people have editorialized that we now exist in a kind of post-factual democracy. Do you think that's true, or do you think it's simply the case that in this current electoral cycle and in the current kind of political climate we're existing in, truths and facts seem to be bent beyond the breaking point?
I don't think it's so much post-factual as kind of post-authority. It's not the facts that are in dispute, it's the holder of the facts or the imparter of the facts. And in that regard, I don't think there's any question that Canada has not been immune at all of this breakdown in authority. I mean, it's most acute with the political class, but it extends right across the spectrum. I think the additional twist on that is that with the, and I might add, it was extended to the media as well. So, I mean, Doug was circulating a Gallup poll from the United States that had faith in media to impart facts impartially and honestly has fallen from 76% to 32% since the mid-'70s, and among Republican voters it's down to 14%. There are more people who believe that Elvis is alive and living in Bowmanville than 14%. And so there's no longer the same kind of community bulletin board that we all go to share a common sense of what is going on. And in its place, with this fragmented media, is an echo chamber. I can not only remove myself from facts I don't like, I can just become immersed in facts that reconfirm my bias, that put me in touch with people who think exactly the same that I do, and reinforce the truthiness of those facts based on that echo chamber.
Neil?
In Bethesda, Maryland, where I lived, it's mostly Democrat. Most of those people never meet a Republican, don't want to meet a Republican, don't want to have dinner with a Republican. And across the river in Virginia, which is, well, not Northern Virginia, but Virginia gets very red the more you go. They don't want to have anything to do with them. They don't know anything about each other. They don't have any desire to know about each other. And they all distrust the media. It's true. And you know, to a certain extent, we brought that upon ourselves. We genuflect dreadfully to authority, and we always have. We see ourselves as important and part of the process. Well, you can't. Look, I mean, remember on Parliament Hill when they used to have a budget, they would have a bunch of experts up there.
Yeah.
There weren't very many anti-poverty experts amongst those experts. There would be the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, and there would be the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and there would be pollsters, and there'd be various people, and various interest groups, but very seldom would there be an anti-poverty advocate. We are part of the power elite, and we're seen as that. What we're really talking here is about a distrust of elites. And the elites get it wrong a lot. Still, I'm one of those people that still believes that there are facts, that there are, you know, Derrida and Foucault argue that there are no facts, there are only constructs. I would say that we should stipulate certain things as fact. The media has fallen down even in that regard with all of this false equivalence of ours. We can't bring ourselves to call Trump a liar when he lies. But
they do, and it doesn't seem to matter.
No, that's true. Not with him. It's remarkable. It's you know, there's such a fog of untruths come from that man's mouth that fact checking has become irrelevant. I mean, Glenn Kessler at the Washington Post routinely gives him 4 Pinocchios, and it doesn't matter. There was a New York Times piece about the difference between lying and bullshitting, and they said that he's a bullshitter, which is to say that he believes it's all true, and it doesn't matter anyway, right? The distrust of the elites, I can understand it, but ultimately you have to have them. And you know, when you try to disabuse yourself or of the elites or try to overthrow them, it just doesn't work. It hasn't worked, as a matter of fact, in the States. The original, what led to Donald Trump, I would say, is the Tea Party. It started with the Rick Santelli rant on CNBC in 2009. And it was a rebellion against the stupid decisions of the governing elite, failing to rein in the venal greed of Wall Street, and punishing virtuous behavior and rewarding bad behavior. And Occupy Wall Street had much the same origins, and they both failed. The Tea Party has produced Donald Trump, not a conservative, and the Occupy Wall Street movement just disintegrated. Where is it now? They had such traction and they disappeared.
It's in power in Ottawa.
Yeah. Bernie Sanders.
Well, I've only been back a year.
That remains to be seen. Susan, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I don't know about post-fact, but I do think that we are in post-partisan times. I'm not sure that people are making political choices based on what they think anymore as much as what they feel. And again, I think the media is somewhat culpable for this too. That people started telling us they didn't want to, well, we'll remember going back as far as Meech Lake, people told us they weren't reading enough about the Constitution, so we gave it to them, and then they told us we don't know anything about what's in the Meech Lake or Charlottetown deals. So I think the media, after those big dramas and big policy dramas of the 1980s and early 90s, kind of gave up on giving people substance and decided to give them what they want. We live in a world now where we can measure what people want to read all the time, by clicks, by the hour, by the minute. And as I'm fond of saying, you can measure what people want to read and consume, but you can't measure what they need to read and consume.
Boy, that's,
So,
watch it.
I believe someone's trying to do that south of the border, actually. But
what's that?
well, yes, I fear someone will try and do that south of the border.
Yeah.
Become an arbiter of what it is you need to be reading,
Yeah.
not what you want to read.
So I thought the last election was interesting because it was an exercise of feelings as well. It was who could harness fear, who could harness hope. And in some ways that's always true in elections. But the parties and their platforms and their ideas didn't really have a whole lot to do with the election choices last time. And maybe 'twas ever thus, but I do think that thanks to the theme of my last book was about advertising and marketing's influence on politics. And I do think that when that happens, that the focus turns less from how you make people think, how you make people change their minds, to how you make people feel and emotion. And I think that in that kind of a world, that raises the idea, because feelings, everybody's entitled to their own feelings. Feelings can change, feelings don't have to have a reason, and that explains a lot of, you know, the volatile landscape now.
I'd like to return to a couple of points that have been raised about the media, but I'm going to just, if we can just sort of stop for a moment and talk a little bit about what you just touched on, which is this sort of notion that the way people are receiving information now or processing the information has to do more with what they feel. And there's actually an interesting piece of political analysis, I think it was in the New York Times this weekend, which basically said we've been looking, in terms of trying to analyze what's going on in the US political election, we've been looking at the kind of wrong sort of demographic filters and distinctions, and that what we should really be looking at is the more interesting distinction between people who watch and people who read. And that there's a kind of a more visceral response to people like Trump and a more cerebral response to people like Clinton. And so there may be a kind of more sort of empirical, fact-based demographic that's responding to what she has to say, and a group of people who look at Trump and go, I don't really care what he's saying. It's irrelevant to me, because what I am watching and observing is someone who shares a set of values. So what the fact base is not as important to me. The other thing I'd like to sort of explore a little bit is this notion of whether or not, where the facts come from. And I think it was sort of Alan that touched on it a bit, which is this sort of notion of the various channels people are, there's a mistrust in the media generally. It's certainly truer amongst Republicans in the States, and it's been quite dramatic in the last 3 or 4 years. And a conservative commentator there, I think, observed that part of the problem was that they'd spent so many years trying to discredit the mainstream media that they'd actually succeeded. And this was someone who was obviously a never Trump supporter, but basically said, you know, we basically told people that they can't believe anything they read in the New York Times or the Washington Post or see on ABC News or NBC News. So if they're fact-checking Trump, people go, yeah, but you told us that they're biased. You told us that they lie and that they have their own set of facts. So there's that. There's an issue of mistrust in the media, but there's also where people are getting their information. And if they're getting it from the internet as opposed to a news source, then they're more likely to find facts that fit their own predisposition. So can you talk a little bit about the extent to which you think the sort of technology that's been driven by technology, this sort of the notion that there's access to any close quote fact you want exists on the internet, and you can find probably what you perceive to be kind of credible support for any fact you want to find, or conspiracy theory or anything else on the internet. Alan?
Well, I do think that a discredited, fragmented, echo chamber media is part of the authenticity paradox. But I think it's also deeper than that, and it's a culmination of a number of trends that have been evolving and accelerating recently. On the feeling rather than thinking, I mean, what we've seen is that one of the kind of unanticipated consequences of the rise of cynicism towards politics and politicians is that people are using a different criteria today, a much softer criteria, to make political judgments than they were in the past. Having concluded that there's no more great men or women, at best what people look for is good men or women. And so instead of evaluating people based on their competence and their accomplishment, things of greatness, they measure them based on personality, but I like to have a beer with them, feel, and also their values. Not do I share their values, but do they have values and strong values? Because strong values and the willingness to say something that obviously is unpopular is a demonstration that you're not lying. It's actually a filter. The demographic part, again, I think it manifests itself in watching rather than leading, but also is deeper, because we've shifted from kind of a progress is normal ethos. Everything's always going to get better. Opportunity is unlimited, increasingly to a zero-sum notion that opportunity is shrinking and some are getting more than their fair share than others. If opportunity is limitless, you have a sense of well-being. And when you have a sense of well-being, you have a sense of goodwill. If you're successful, that doesn't take away from my success because it's unlimited. Once I become anxious that opportunity is passing me by, your success is a direct threat to me. You have something that I can't get because it's now limited. So guess what? I don't like you. You are them, and I am us. And all those who find themselves in my same position, which is why white, poorly educated, and peripherally trailer park in congressional district are the three best predictors of voting for Donald Trump, because these are the people who are most likely to feel that way. Last point, and it relates to the elites that we've talked about here, is that the distrust of elites is because they did not allow these changes to be stopped. They willfully let a zero-sum society evolve. And it's not just politicians, it's clergy, labor leaders, people who run beer companies. It's right across the board. And not only did they not protect me, which is why I don't like elites, they disproportionately benefited from this, which is why I want to skin them alive. So, I mean, I think there's a complicated confluence of all of those things that has created this, you know, what for most of us is an incomprehensible political dynamic in the United States. In no small part, to the point that you were making, is because none of us have experienced any of those things.
Yeah.
It's a hackneyed thing to say, but people believe what they want to believe. If you've worked in the Middle East, you will understand that. Facts do not matter where deep passions run. I've been in a crowd of Tea Partiers just when it first started forming. And it went something like this. What do you want? Want less government, smaller government. Okay, what do you want less of? Do you want less defense? No, we got to be a strong nation. Okay. Do you want less Medicare? No, we paid into that. What about Social Security? We paid into that too. One woman said, "I'll have you know, sir, that Medicare is not a government program." What about Medicaid? Well, they've all got relatives who are collecting Medicaid. Otherwise, they wouldn't probably have time to be at this demonstration. So they didn't want to. What about So you go through all these things with them, and then you say, okay, we've accounted now for about 95% of government spending. What do you want to cut? Waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, okay, so we're going to save $1 trillion with waste, fraud, and abuse, and it's easy to snicker at that, but then take a look at what the elites believe and what we've been feeding people for a long time. We believe, okay, we're elite, for heaven's sake, and what do we well, we're real. Yeah. What do we believe? We believe, for example, we've told people for a long time that if you're virtuous, if you save your money and you're careful and you pay your mortgage and you follow the rules, you will get a return on your investment when you're old. All gone. The reckless behavior was rewarded by governments and institutions. Savers were punished. We told people that if you print money, inflation will follow. Everybody believed that. They printed $5 trillion at the Fed, 15 trillion or something like that worldwide. Inflation hasn't moved. Chairman Greenspan thought it was a great idea not to regulate credit default swaps and to allow the kind of behavior that led to the creation of collateralized debt obligations. We see where that went.
And was called maestro as a consequence.
Yeah.
Remarkable, but I was saying to Alan earlier on, having printed all this money, the conventional thinking has been that it's all got to be reeled in. You've got to bring it back in and raise interest rates at some point. Ben Bernanke said the other day that may be some place where we can't come home from. So that's out the window. So in the search for objective, all of these things that we just took as biblical truths in the elite have all failed. And to a large extent, they have failed people that are at the low end of the socioeconomic scale, the people that are at that Tea Party rally, by the way. So, you can't really, it's hard to blame them for being mad. The thing is that, Donald Trump is probably not the answer. Although, who knows? Look, I mean, they had a president whose resume included acting with a monkey. And that turned out okay, right? So there are checks and balances in the American system. Maybe the president's just the guy you want to have a beer with. And
And a
Maybe yes,
nuclear engineer
maybe
that
yes,
didn't turn
minister
out
was
to be-
right. Maybe there is.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Well, and they had a nuclear engineer who didn't turn out to be the best president they ever
well,
had either.
Bush
so.
would say nuclear.
Yeah, a nuclear. Well, and I think, I mean, to your point,
There's a
Neil, if you
beautiful
look at
shot.
the voters who voted Leave in Brexit, it was exactly that. It was communities in Northern England that had been completely decimated by the sort of collapse of the industrial sector there. And they have absolutely there is no self-interest, there's no rational self-interest that they are pursuing in voting Leave. But it was also, there is nothing about the current institutional structure that has served those people, and no particular reason, I think, why they would listen to David Cameron or Gordon Brown or any of the other so-called experts that were arrayed to tell them that, you know, their lives were going to be ruined if they left. They're looking at it and going, our lives are already pretty.
I don't think we can make enough of the financial failure of 2008,
No.
of the nearly worldwide meltdown occasioned by the greed of Wall Street and the misbehavior of something that was effectively a criminal conspiracy of incredible proportions from home buyers all the way up to the credit rating agencies. And the failure was enormous, and it slammed into to middle class America, and it's still, black America still hasn't recovered from it.
Yeah.
75% of the homes in the south side of Chicago are still underwater. You know, the people that did that were rewarded, and everybody, the only people that suffered were people who had been behaving virtuously or who had been preyed upon. And out of the shambles walked the elites with unbruised.
So I go
Susan?
back a little farther in where I think this started, and I reflect on this a lot, and I go to Archie Bunker. And that was
Geez,
that was a funny show to people like us. But I think there were my first father-in-law actually quite liked Archie Bunker because he sounded like him.
Yeah.
That Archie Bunker was saying things that people were saying themselves, and he gave them permission to feel this way. So Norman Lear's great experiment in making Americans feel a bit icky about those sentiments of Archie Bunker instead affirmed them. Last summer, a friend and I were talking about what makes an authentic politician, and I had the Archie Bunker thing in my mind, and I said, I think it's less about what the politician is sending and more about what the people are receiving. And if they're getting affirmed in their ideas by somebody, they tend to think, hey, that guy, he knows what he's talking about because he sounds like me. So what people don't want anymore is their minds to be changed. We were emailing back and forth a few weeks ago. I'm not sure how old this cartoon is, New Yorker cartoon, but it's my favorite cartoon of late by a guy named Paul Noth. And it features a bunch of sheep on a hillside looking at a billboard. And on the billboard is the wolf, and the wolf says, I am going to eat you. And the sheep are saying, he tells it like it is. And that sort of goes to the affirmation idea, right? That we've come so far in this, that it is so wrong now and so politically incorrect to tell people what they want to hear. You hear that a lot from people. I don't like that guy. He's just telling me what I want to hear. That the polar opposite of it, like telling people what they don't want to hear, I am going to eat you, is seen as an authentic thing to do. So Rob Ford is a good example of that. I always raise Rob Ford's name when people get smug about Donald Trump here. But I think I'm coming to the conclusion that when we're looking for authenticity in politics, we're studying too much what is being transmitted than what people are receiving.
Can I ask you something? Have you figured out why people are so willing to vote against their own economic self-interest, especially in the States?
Well, I mean,
You study these things.
yeah, that
Tom Frank wrote a book
Tom
about
Frank
it.
wrote a book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And he basically, it's why people in Kansas voting Republican. It's crazy. It's because they believe that Democrats look down their nose at them, would rather hang out Steven Spielberg and Barbara
Hollywood,
Streisand
yeah.
than them. But on the point that Susan was making, Rob Ford specific, just an illustration of what you're saying.
You're going to tell that the Rob Ford story. I love.
We did some focus
this.
groups for an agency that was aghast that Toronto, this cultural epicenter of the world, refinery, could elect this guy, and got us to do some focus groups.
Only
with,
in Ottawa would you get laughs for that,
with-
by the way. In Toronto, that would have been a straight line.
with Rob Ford with Rob Ford voters, and we had people saying things like, "Look, I know this guy is a no-necked, leather-lunged, short-fingered vulgarian, but let me tell you, and I don't believe in a lot of the things he stands for, but at least I know that he believes in what he stands for, and I'd rather cope with that than have some blustering bullshitter who's trying to tell me what I think I want to hear when he or she doesn't know me at all."
Didn't they also tell you he's too stupid to lie?
Well, that's part of no, but that's why I say holding strong views is almost a protector against lies. But the final point there is that a lot of people, when they talk about this authenticity paradox, associate it with Trumps and Fords, and that it's not a right-wing phenomenon at all. That the feelings of anxiety are most acute among voters whose tendency is to embrace right-wing sentiments, but it's much broader than that. Bernie Sanders is clearly a demonstration of that. Naheed Neshi, who was elected exactly the same year in Cowtown, backwards oil patch Cowtown, elects an Ishmaeli single, in quotes, 38-year-old. In both of those instances, voter turnout went up 50% over the previous. I mean, there's an argument that Justin Trudeau's victory was in part a function of a perceived authenticity. And so it's a broader phenomena than us just looking down our nose saying, look at those ignoramuses, buying this crap when clearly it's not fact-based.
I have a feeling that I'm willing to concede that there might be a generational thing going on here that I've missed. Because my kids, who are pretty well educated, and their peers who are pretty well educated, really like this hopey, changey stuff that Justin Trudeau serves up. And he does sound like a younger Barack Obama. You remember, "We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For"? It made no sense at all, but people loved it. Trudeau, the day that Trudeau was sworn in, some reporter asked him something, and the reporters in Ottawa are like a bunch of battered spouses. They're so happy that nobody's kicking them anymore that they'll put up with them. And that's my observation, not having been here for 17 years. But he was asked something at the swearing in, and he said that this is more or less a direct quote: "The strength of our diversity is the diversity of our voices going forward." I have no idea what that means. It sounds great, and my kids loved it.
It was more than just hopey-feely. I mean, before the election, he stood to legalize pot. That doesn't sound like good politics to me. He refused to allow any caucus member to be against abortion. In the campaign, again, he went completely against the orthodoxy that balanced budgets are good. He said he believed something. And those two early initiatives were designed very, very particular to do that.
I'm going to just want to circle back to sort of try and get a little more granular on this subtopic about losing faith in experts and not just politicians. One of the things I want to touch on, we talked about a little bit earlier, and that is this sort of ability of people to find their own information or their own set of facts, that there is no consensus about what reality is and what the kind of governing set of facts are. One of the things I think you've all touched on in a different way about talking about how people are drawn to either the Trumps or the Fords, or to a lesser extent as Trudeau, is the notion that people find it empowering. They are empowered by their vote, and they're empowered by voting for people who look like them or share a set of values. And that was particularly true in Brexit, where some of the lead sort of Brexit campaigners were basically saying there are no beyond Gov saying who cares about experts. One of the more interesting quotes I saw was from one of the lead campaigners who basically said the only expert there is the voter. That's the only expert. And I think for a lot of those people who felt really disempowered and alienated from the sort of institutional elites and structures, basically said, yeah, I'm actually going to exercise my power in the only way I can. Some of them didn't actually believe it would have any kind of effect. But it's essentially saying, I'm going to vote for me. I'm going to vote for how I perceive my interests. Maybe it's not correctly, but I don't care what you're telling me. And one of the things that I think is that's related to beyond the sort of ability to find any fact you want on the internet and supporting document is also, and this may have some pertinence to people in this audience, is that there is a multiplicity now of experts. And part of the problem is there's a million different experts out there, and many of them can be bought for $1 or $2. And
be bought, too.
yeah, well, the New York Times actually did
me.
an interesting piece about a month ago where they looked at 75 think tanks in the United States, which were supposed to be, these are basically just supposed to be academics or people who only care about, the search for truth in a kind of Platonic sense. And of course, the reality was virtually all of them had people who were working for private interests, who would go before Congress and testify without ever, as think tank experts, without ever revealing who their private sector clients were or where their own kind of interests lie. And in no publication of any of their publications does it list who their clients are. And they basically made the case it's not illegal. But in some instances, it might be unethical, and surely it would be useful to know before you asked a so-called expert whether or not he was in fact in the pay or she was in the pay of a corporate interest whose agenda they might be advancing. Do you think it's fair to say that part of the problem is that people are losing faith in experts because experts deserve to have some faith lost in them?
You know what they call a guy who graduated last in his class in medical school?
Don't say dentist.
Doctor. I mean,
Yeah.
Every profession has fools, and as Mark Starowitz used to say, we go for the talker, not the expert, right? The expert who can speak in the most Cartesian fashion and who is the most convincing is the one we'll go to. But for heaven's sake, we need experts. I mean, there are people in the States that think it's a good idea to get rid of the Fed. There are Republicans who think it's a good idea to give Congress control over the Fed. I don't think it's such a hot idea to have politicians in charge of our money supply, and I also don't think it's a good idea to have voters in charge of the money supply. I think experts should be, and I think they've done a reasonable job.
But there's an argument that experts are elites, same way politicians are, and have been as wrong as the politicians, and as unwilling to protect this anxiety-ridden voters' best interest. You raised it with economics. The propagating all of these basic economic theories that prove to be wrong. Scientists say, that in the wilderness that we should protect flora and fauna. The average person says, I want to go camping and shoot something in there. And you can find examples again and again and again where people discount expertise because they do not believe that expertise is consistent with their reality and their best interests.
You follow that logic far enough down the road and you get to that
I'm not
business
defending it, I'm just trying to
No,
explain
but
it.
if you follow that logic far enough, you get to that idea that I managed a gas station in Tub Hollow, so that gives me qualifies me to go and manage your national finances because it's all really just a gas station in the end.
And that's exactly what you're hearing at Trump rallies.
Yeah.
I don't know how many of you have had an experience in the classroom lately, but as I've seen, now the professor standing at the front of the room, the so-called expert, is not an expert anymore. Right? The students have sitting in front of them, in between them and the professor, is a laptop. And so they are sitting there and the professor will say something and the students are fact-checking them, right? So, and we are all doing that basically in our lives every day. Like this person is sitting telling me this. Well, I don't need to believe that. I'll pull out my phone or I'll call that up on Google. I had a jarring experience. I think it was last summer. A doctor friend of mine pulled down and she said, "Does that look like skin cancer to you?" And I almost went over to the computer to see whether I could diagnose a doctor's skin cancer. Right? And something's wrong with this picture, but that's the world we're living in, where I think I have access to the same information that the experts do, or the guy who graduated first or last in his class in medical school.
Well, in fact, in one of the primary debates between Rubio and Trump, we're having a discussion about God knows what, but at some point, Rubio sort of threw out this fact that Trump had hired undocumented Polish workers. And Trump was like, that's a lie, that's wrong, that's absolutely wrong. And Rubio said, no, it's true. And he goes, people are probably Googling, looking out at the audience, people are probably Googling that right now.
Yeah.
And of course, sure enough, some news source went back and said there was a 700% spike in searches for Polish workers during a kind of 15-minute period during this debate. And of course, if you Googled Polish work, God only knows what you'd find if you Googled Polish workers, one can only imagine. But the point was, there was a set of facts, close quotes, that people believe because it's on the internet. I mean, Donald Trump himself sort of spewing some of these conspiracy theories, saying, well, it's on the internet. So I Googled it, it's there, so it must be true. So on one hand, you have access to masses of information without any kind of ability. There's no sort of curation function that says this is credible or not credible. My point about experts was not that we should abandon experts, but that there's, I think, a lot of cynicism baked in to people about how they now read expert opinion, because they know a great deal of expert opinion has been purchased.
I think the best headline of the post-truth era was just last week, where it actually moved as an alert on my internet machine, and it said, Donald Trump declares Obama born in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man, that's like an acid trip, though. Trump acknowledges the president was born
Not
in the United
acknowledge, just
States.
says, right? Yeah.
Admits or
Yeah.
concedes
Yeah.
or something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah, we've got, at the sewer of this whole search for authenticity thing, by the way, is the term political correctness.
Yeah.
It's become incredibly powerful in the States. I've been gone a long time, but and really a lot of political correctness is just sort of early onset politeness. But it's become, the term has become a weapon, and to a certain extent it is because of the prissiness of the political left and the censoriousness of the political left. This is just an observation on my part, but free speech is not terribly popular anymore. You hear, I actually heard the president of the student body at Stanford last year said there's far too much free speech nowadays. The idea being that we need to be inoffensive. And of course, inoffensive speech doesn't need protection. But the whole idea that the censoriousness, Nat Hentoff calls it herds of independent thinkers, especially in the academy, looking down their nose at the rest of society and basically telling them how they should think, really rubs people the wrong way. And it fuels. And unfortunately, the overreaction is the rise of a goof who tells everybody that it's okay to say things like Mexicans are rapists or blacks are criminals. And I was just in Chicago, and Trump has made it okay to say things that when we were in the 70s, it would have been unthinkable to say these things, and you just see them said all over the place. Bannon, who is Trump's architect now, has outright aligned himself with the alt-right movement, comes from Breitbart, for heaven's sake. I mean, this is thinly disguised white supremacy, and this is okay.
No, it's nativist stuff.
And that's why I think you have to treat a subject like this with some alarm. It's not just an academic question, because once you have societies that are polarizing into us-thems, I mean, any politician who is smart knows that to till that soil is fertile ground. And then they start concentrating, as they do in many campaigns now, is not on persuading voters. I mean, every politician I worked with while I was doing politics all wanted to become more popular and get more voters. Stephen Harper was the first guy I ever came across who didn't. That he was happy with 35%, as long as his voters were 50% more likely and to vote than the other guys, and those guys were split. He was completely happy to preach to that parish. But as Neil points out, once you get a politician preaching directly to you, to us, against them, and demonizing the other, then it legitimizes my worst instincts to start amplifying that. And that is a prescription for a very, very nasty political culture.
Can we talk a bit about the role of the media in policing
what
this?
Susan brought up, about those hellish damned apps that they have now, Chartbeat, I can tell any minute how many people are reading a column that I've written, how long they are staying on it, and what portal they come from. If you don't, Marty Barron, the managing editor of the Washington Post, I had supper with him a while back, and he kept pulling out his iPhone and checking Chartbeat, And we were talking about it, and he said, I try not to, because there is supposed to be some educational aspect to journalism, or, I mean, for Indigenous people is a big one. We know we're supposed to write
Right,
about that,
but
but
nobody
write
wants to
about it and
read the
watch what
story.
happens. The numbers tank. I had that discussion with Heather, our vice president. And what do you do? Like, if you know that the Israel, the Middle East, Israel, Palestine's another one, write about that and watch what happens. Off the cliff. So what do? Do you write about it or not? And when you know what people are interested
Write
in,
about it.
it's and the Globe and Mail, Philip Crowley has
Makes a great
floated.
virtue out of
Well,
it.
they've floated the idea
Outside.
of paying people based on their clicks.
Yeah.
You know, when you go there, reporters are going to write about what they know, not what they think the public wants, but what they know the public
Well, I
wants.
think the other thing, and I do want to spend some time talking about the role of the responsibility of the media to try and monitor some of this stuff, but something you're pointing to, because this whole kind of sort of social news aggregation and other online systems that rely on so-called social proof of whether or not stories are read or whether they're important to people. The problem is that those kind of online democratic rating systems where people are clicking or voting or saying they basically allow the spread of false, I mean, they really do allow a kind of amplification of these false stories or conspiracy
You're talking about
theories
the
or false
comment sections?
No, not even those, like stories that basically have, it's basically if a story goes,
Yeah.
it's like if a story is going viral, there's no reason, it's not going viral because it's true. It's going viral because people
It can
are,
go viral because it's true.
well,
But
it
often
can.
because it's sensational.
But it's
and
often
surprising.
because it's sensational, and the kinds of things that get the likes are not the things that are
Yeah.
fact-laden. I'd like to talk a bit about the media's responsibility for trying to sort of police this, because we're in a kind of interesting world right now where, for example, Chris Wallace is saying the role of a moderator at a U.S. presidential debate is not to fact-check during the debate. On the other hand, you have people complaining about the fact that CNN is running crawls that will say, you know, Trump said blah, 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 lies, or
People complain
or
about
the
Jimmy
New York
Fallon.
Times, yeah, that people complained about Fallon normalizing
Yeah.
racism. So can you, certainly I'd like you all to talk a bit about it, but Susan, can you talk a bit about what you think the media's responsibility is in terms of this larger sense of policing facts or policing the expertise that is offered?
Well, as Alan said, increasingly less and less. You know, there used to be a sort of a fireside or a hearth in Canada. It was called the National, and everybody would gather up around it in the evening and talk about an agreed-on set of facts and things that happened during the day. There isn't that centralized, unless you talk about Tim Hortons, right? But they're not dispensing facts. So I'm not sure that the media industry, my business, such as it is struggling to survive right now. And it has to care about those things called clicks. And they have to tell advertisers, look, our site is getting a lot of traffic. It's not, the fragmentation is one issue too, but the media, as Neil and Alan have alluded to too, is seen as part of the problem too. It's seen as, so I'm not sure that it is in a policing role anymore. I'm not sure that the public accepts it. I think they accept curation. I think they don't even mind opinion, but I don't know that people think as much as they used to that the media decides what is important yesterday and what is significant and what is true.
But I'm assuming you believe they still have a responsibility to point it out when it is not factually true.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, but find a set of agreed upon facts in the Middle East. Go ahead.
Yeah.
You know, this search for authenticity is playing hell with us. We had this. We set up this nonsensical idea many years ago that you know, if a thing with feathers and a beak crosses the road, you don't say it's a chicken. You get one expert to say it's a chicken, then you get another expert to say it might not be a chicken, then you do a stand-up saying that only time will tell whether indeed that's a chicken. Right? And I was telling Alan earlier, I was told one time, because I contradicted the Soviet first secretary many years ago after a spy expulsion, he said, we don't spy in Canada. And I said, oh yes you do. And Canada spies on you too. And I was called in and said, if you call the representative of a foreign government a liar again on national television, you'll be fired. That's changed. That's boy, is that gone. I'm probably telling stories out of school here, but in a couple of weeks, CBC is going to announce, CBC, the most conservative news organization the country has ever seen, is going to announce that it has an opinion page. And I am going to be called an opinion columnist. This is against the prime directive. 25 years ago, we were to express no opinions. But we know if we're going to survive, and this demand for authenticity, we can't keep pretending that may or may not be a chicken. We have to stipulate a certain set of facts, and people have to know where you're coming from. And if Donald Trump says that he was he was against the Iraq War, that people want you to say that no, he's not. That's a lie. You don't have to say it's a lie. You say that's just simply not true. Jake Tapper does that a lot now. Kai Ryssdal on National Public Radio does that, and it is a response. I tell you, I know for a fact that it is a response to what in private meetings at the CBC, and I'm sure at newspapers across the country, it is said time and time again, we simply can't keep doing this. We are not going to survive if we keep this stuff up. We have to, we've got to pull the curtain back, and people don't mind analysis as long as they know where you're coming from.
Yeah.
That's right.
I mean, our failure has been to provide a diversity of voices, and we're going to go out and try to find a conservative columnist, and maybe a religious columnist, and maybe a socialist columnist. And
I think that is part of the problem, because the traditional media has let their authority go away. I mean, anyone who thinks that people are tuning into the National at 10 o'clock because they don't know what happened that day is delusional. And if they didn't know what happened that day, you don't want them as
They're
audience.
not watching
they
the
want
news
to see
anymore.
me.
Daily newspapers are even worse.
Yeah.
Right? I'm going to wait a whole day to find out what happened yesterday. And so with the traditional media that has authority, with credentialized journalists, I think have to play their traditional role, which is to comfort the afflicted and afflict
I love that definition.
the comfortable, that they are the fourth estate. They are there to arm individuals with the information they need to protect their rights, and to hold those accountable who, left to their own devices, would do ill. And that means telling people not what they want to know, but what they need to know.
Yeah.
But what media, I think, has failed to do is find a new way of doing that, where they can compete effectively against the blogs and the digitals and the aggregators and everything. And that is with opinion, analysis, investigative reporting,
And
context.
attitude.
Yes, all of those things that, I mean, you read, if you haven't read it, it's really worth it, is Doris Kearns Goodwin's The Bully Pulpit.
Yeah.
And about what McClure did at McClure magazine. I mean, it's just, you read it and you just say, oh, if anyone could do that today, would be, give Ida Tarbell, 18 months to write 50,000 word article on Lincoln over the course of 18 issues, just.
But that's why some of the best reporting is coming out of organizations like The Guardian that are basically foundations
but
and
that's
have nothing to
coming
do
to
with
an
profit.
That's
Well, that's
coming
going to come to an
too.
end. But
The Guardian is becoming hobbled financially, as is the Tampa Bay Tribune, which has a similar trust. The business model is broken. The Toronto Star has shed 80% of its equity over the last 8 or 9 years. I mean, this costs money, and it's not there. And I don't know what the answer. I really
But I
don't know
think
what
that's
the
the
answer
other
is.
part of things, because you're right, the business model has got to change.
Just
I don't
to
know
echo
how.
what Neil was sort of saying, or to provide another, the Star, when I was the bureau chief of it, was very interested in the early influence of the net here on politics and readership, because the Star wasn't distributed here. So our big strength, or our readership, was basically online. So we paid a huge amount of attention to the numbers and to the stats and what got attention and what didn't. And an early discovery we made, and I noticed that other places did too, was, all newspapers used to have a thing called the notebook column, and it was sort of a weekly gathering of all the, funny or wacky things that happened during the day or during the week, little things that wouldn't make it into the news. And I noticed the Star was one of the media organizations that tried to start that online, and CBC did as well. And those things were always unbylined. They had no byline on them. There was just everybody in the bureau. Nobody read those things. They were wildly popular when
The
they were
journalists did.
The journalists loved them. But what did change when people started to read political blogs and what newspapers were putting out online in that same vein is when it had an I attached to it, or a me, or a byline, or a person. Then suddenly people thought, oh, I know where this is coming from. So there are still people in journalism who preach that you can't use I or
It's a
me
big
in
deal,
a
yeah.
story, right? You have to now. The people need, there is so much out there, they have access to so much information that they definitely need to know authorship of it too. They need, you know, maybe there's something in the fact that author and authenticity are from similar Greek roots or whatever, but there is an idea that you can't do things anonymously anymore, and you do need to have a bit of a personality. People want personality, opinion, a voice in
The same
in
way
their
they
news.
want from authentic politicians.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly the same criteria. You want to know you believe
I'm-
in something.
Yeah.
I'm mindful of the fact that we want to leave some time for questions and, of
Oh, I
course,
thought you were gonna say
answers.
cocktails.
No, well, cocktails too. Yeah. So I actually wanted to try and sort of ask one final question of our panelists, which is, I'm not sure it's an answerable one. But if we assume all these things are true, that there's a declining faith in institutions and in experts and a sense of inauthenticity about our leaders and our politicians and the people who head institutions, so that people have less faith in facts and more reliance on emotion, is there anything people can do as professional communicators, as people who are researchers, as people who are concerned about these issues and the health of our public discourse? Is there anything that can be done to turn that around?
You want a comm strategy.
No, I don't want a common strategy. I want some
Yeah.
thinking
If
about
a lot
that.
of the
Alan,
manifestation of this is the animus that is directed towards elites. Elites
Right.
clearly have got to get their shit together. I mean, the number again of the politicians that I've worked with, who you talk to, they're warm, they're funny, they're insightful.
Yeah.
They walk up to that podium, and all of a sudden they turn into a big, blustering bullshitter who's performing a stereotype of what a politician
Yeah.
is supposed to look like. Well, you know, people's bullshit meters are on overdrive all the time. They have to learn. Scientists have to learn. You know, politicians have to learn. Doctors have to learn a new way of dealing with a very, very different public and customer base out there. And until they do learn that, and I think some have, and part of it is being brutally honest, being prepared to say you're wrong when you're wrong. Unfortunately, saying that the benefit of the doubt is not going to be extended to anyone who has done anything wrong or ill towards. And, you know, just have that kind of demeanor that says, I can withstand the truth, even if the truth is not going to put me in good stead for the time being.
I was, before I came here, I was trying to figure out what defined an authentic politician, or what people call authentic politician. I suspect my view of what an authentic politician would be different than the masses. But my little list was, it's got to be someone comfortable in his or own skin. And I'm thinking back as far as Jean Chrétien. People loved him because he looked comfortable. You know, he wasn't a rock star, he wasn't a movie star looks, but he was comfortable with it. And I think Trudeau has that same thing. We saw that a bit with Leighton too. But Trump and Rob Ford too look totally comfortable with themselves. They say they're just like you, but often they're not. In fact, the great irony is that
exactly.
they are some of the richest people. Rob Ford came from wealthy families, so does Donald Trump. But they somehow have a way of conveying that they are just like people. They have no self-doubt whatsoever. They don't look rattled by contrary facts, and they're unpredictable. That's, I think people have decided that an unpredictable politician is an authentic one, because a predictable politician does the standing at a podium and saying everything that
Scripted,
people want to hear. So I don't know that that's a recipe, but it does seem to be those are the traits they have in common.
Not like anybody else. There's some of them that are, I mean, they're honest and they work hard. And we probably should acknowledge that more often than we do, and instead of being so professionally cynical. I can name 7 or 8 that come right up to the top of my mind, and I'm sure there were more, right? But the fact is that suasion and artifice works, and it always has. You know, Jean Chrétien is a wealthy man who wore cashmere suits, and then until he became leader, at which point he started wearing cheaper clothes deliberately.
Yeah.
And I mean, I used to walk beside him on the canal to work, and he would have a $4,000 suit on, and suddenly he's got a $180 blazer from Tip Top Tailors. It was very smart, but it had nothing to do with Jean Chrétien. So I mean, this stuff works, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Never mind television anchors or the aura that you can create for yourself. It's just a matter of fact. I mourn the death of the expert and the death of institutions. We need them, but you can't. I mean, we're not. You can't lead people. You can't talk people into things they don't want. These and you know the from our end of the business, the failing business model, coupled with the knowing exactly what the audience votes for or goes for, is a lethal bloody combination. You know, there are things we should not be indifferent to that we are being indifferent to because we know that look, the best example of telling people what they didn't want to hear, remember the Meech Lake?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think it cost the CBC its leadership in the ratings. We just decided that we were going to have 14 items on Meech Lake every day. You know, and we started out, as Mordecai Richler pointed out, some nights Peter would start out by saying, we were pro Meech Lake. And Peter would start out saying, bad news today for on the Meech Lake front because, you know, it had suffered some setback. Whereas, as Richler pointed out, an awful lot of Canadians thought it was probably good news. But, you know, we were didactic and it's deadly. I don't really pretend I know the answers to the questions.
No, I think there's also a kind of, I know sort of Alan and I, there's probably endless focus groups we've sat in for political campaigns where you're showing groups ads and they say the problem with the ad is there's not enough information in it. Why aren't you giving us more information? And of course, if you then did an ad that was replete with information, they'd be snoozing on the desk or turn it, the dials would be turned way down.
We want more economic news.
They want more economic.
Foreign
So
news.
there
No,
always
you don't.
is, I think, it's difficult to kind of strike the balance between things that people actually want to consume as readers or viewers or just as citizens. And the fact that there is actually a kind of that low information voter does exist. They do exist. And low information citizens seem to exist in increasing
And they all
numbers.
have one vote.
I love the poorly educated.
So I think that's, well, I think that's like, I hope we won't end on a really sort of cynical note because
She
I
wasn't
think
the one
a
that
lot
said
of,
that first.
yeah, that was just,
Donald Trump.
exactly. That I think there is you know, if you look at some of the people who sort of study this for a living, they basically say it does become a kind of act of citizenship to go out and learn and inform yourself, and that really what probably is needed is a kind of reboot of how we view democracy and what our responsibility is as citizens, and also as however you function as a member of an elite or simply as a consumer and a voter.
Reboots don't happen though, do they? Do reboots
So-
happen?
Any final thoughts before I open it up for questions? No? Great, thank you all, but questions from the audience? That this young lady in the white.
So I wanted to ask a question that was, you touched on earlier, but from the viewpoint of think tanks and money in politics. So one of the conversations that's happening in the U.S. right now, and I want to hear your perspective from what's happening here, is money in politics. And while people have more mediums than ever to express their voice, they feel like they have less of a voice than ever because there's this revolving door in politics in the U.S. And so special interests rule the day, Wall Street's rigged the deck against everybody else. And so across the political aisle, you know, beyond Donald Trump, there's this notion of, I can't trust the experts anymore. I can't trust my elected officials because they're really in the pocket of somebody else. And so I know that money works differently here, but how much do you think that's at play when we talk about the authenticity paradox on this side of the border?
Do you want to, Susan, you want to take that one?
I honestly think that this is a whole different universe here because of our controls on political donations. You saw, like somebody like Michael Ignatieff told a great story about a wealthy industrialist calling him out for a meeting one night. And he said, I was very glad at the end of the meeting I could just say, okay, well, give me $1,000 like everybody else. Like he didn't feel that he owed him anything. I think that, I don't think that's the problem. And I think, I've done some work on this too. The interesting thing that's happening, and perhaps hopeful thing, is that big data is running political campaigns, and it is incredibly, to use the word granular, it is down to individuals. knocking on doors, gathering up data about people. And I think the hopeful thing about that is that it's making the political parties more responsive to the citizens. The reason the Conservatives won for so many years in Canada was they had better information about their voters. You know, they knew what their voters wanted. And the reason the Liberals won, I think, a large reason the Liberals at least got a majority, was because they did a hell of a lot of work out there building up a database and the technology behind a campaign that had nothing at all to do with big money and had everything to do with what they were hearing on the ground from people. Now, how that translates into government, I don't know. But I actually think that some of the new tools of technology, to sound a hopeful note, actually do introduce a big measure of democracy into the system. And I don't think that's our problem here.
Can I just on that though, because I think something you're touching on is probably the best example I think of what you may be raising is what's going on in this sort of climate change debate, where it's really about warring bodies of expertise, both of which bring very different sets of facts to the table. And I think it's very difficult for citizens to make a determination about what set of facts is the correct set of facts. And pipelines, climate change pipelines, all of those kinds of resource-related issues are really interesting ones because of that. And I think that there's no consensus, or there's less of a consensus than there used to be about what the standard set of facts we should all be operating under is, including, I mean, you would think something as basic as climate change, but there's still certainly lots of people in this country who are basically, if not climate change deniers, they certainly dance up to the edge of it. We had a government in this country for 10 years that only in the last 2 years of its mandate decided that there might be something called climate change. So it really is about warring sets of facts. And I think the problem for institutions like think tanks is, unless they're really transparent about what their perspective and point of view is, it's easy for people to be cynical about the sets of facts they're presenting. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that.
No, I agree that my experience is that money has very, very little to do with the influencing and political process, not only because we have limits, but because we have parliamentary democracy and party discipline. I mean, you know, if I represent a tobacco district in Virginia in the United States, I am subject to the tobacco lobby. There's no question, because I'm going to lose my seat and I will vote against my party whip in favor of tobacco. That would never happen in Canada. What there is, though, is I mean the anti-Ignatieff, he's not here for you. Yeah. The notion that the political class does not understand my interests, first does not represent my interests, is a growing kind of sense among the population, which allows them to hold more and more and more cynical views of the political class.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Ad, because it's something we should have mentioned as well, too. I think that was the first time that the political media in Canada actually started to understand that as many, if not more people in Canada were getting their information from advertising than the media. That, and Justin Trudeau would tell you that too, that Just Not Ready was about as viral as people who thought that Michael Ignatieff was American. You know, if you have the money to finance a huge campaign, that would still be the line.
It's certainly true that private corporate money plays a role in public policy advocacy, though. Big role.
Well, in fact, in a perverse way, the changes in Ontario is going to make more of that, because you know, you're taking out, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars from both the corporate and, very surprisingly, the union sector that can't go into political parties, and it will go into thought leadership. And where you will get influence is because politicians can no longer attend fundraisers, is that you will see the advent of bundlers in this country, which we've never seen before.
What's that?
Which is an individual who will go around, and I say, oh, get $1,500. Well, I'm going to have a couple hundred people over to my house. You're just going to give me $1,500, and I'm going to, it's the old bagman, and I'm going to take a bag to party headquarters. Well, you do that 3 or 4 times a year, and trust me, you'll have some real significant access.
That's nice.
I assume when you talk about money being all important, you're talking about Citizens Be United and the floodgates of money opening in the States. That there's no question, as Alan said, how significant money is, and I think the average congressman spends 6 hours a day on the phone fundraising,
Fundraising.
and they're elected every 2 years. They just never stop fundraising and running for
They never
election.
stop
However,
campaigning.
Barack Obama, the majority of the money he raised in 2008 was $5 or so from billions of people, and Donald Trump is
doing the
beholden
same.
to no one.
Yeah.
The Koch brothers hate him
Yeah.
because he doesn't take their money, and he's kind of a hero because of that, even though he lies about his net worth, you know. And when he becomes president, he's beholden to nobody. That's.
Did you
anyway.
say when?
Sorry,
When he becomes?
I said
Soon.
no. I didn't.
There's a question. Okay, right, yeah.
I'm not exactly sure if this is on, so I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
I was just wondering where you think the bottom of this trend may lie. Are we just going to keep rolling in this direction? Is this lack of faith and expertise going to continue? Or is this something that you think will change? And if so, what are the roles of us, first as individuals who are engaged in political discourse, but also, I'm assuming in this room, as professional communicators in shifting the dialogue?
This is just an idle thought, and then these guys will have smarter ones, but I had been hoping, and I still, I guess, do, that the early days of this new form of communication will be like the early days of newspapers, which were very polarized,
Chaotic.
not so fact-based. And what happened, the rules of journalism are basically actually the law, right? And they're a product of journalists burning people, and so I actually thought the law, in my naive, maybe baby boomers kind of faith in things, thought that the law would sort these things out. And I did, and I have, in political discourse, you can have some effect if you tell people, I'm going to call my lawyer about that. So I think some of the extremes may settle down. And I've noticed, for example, too, I'm sorry for anybody who's I've noticed a real decline in the use of Twitter, like, especially my own. I just go on there now and think, this is just, Neil was an early leaver of it. But I've noticed myself that I don't feel like I'm missing anything. So I think there may be a mass civilizing effect. That's why I keep getting out of bed in the morning. But between the law and people just saying, oh, come on, right?
I don't know where the bottom is. I'm out of the predicting the future game. It's someone once said, if you predict the future, don't put a date on it. But in terms of communications implications, I mean, I think, you know, what professional communicators have to do is start, you know, brushing up on crisis management communications, because that's kind of not, I mean, you're in a situation where the assumption is that whoever you're representing is bad, not good. You have a population who says, I am not going to extend the benefit of the doubt to you. You must prove to me that I should believe you. And you're going to have to start imparting those same kind of tools that you do if you have a product recall, or if you have listeria in, you know, your plane crashes. I mean, that's the kind of dynamic that we're working in.
I hope it doesn't sound terribly unoriginal to say there's nothing really new under the sun. You know, whether this, I don't think much changes really. I'm kind of proud of having gotten on the National and said I thought the Arab Spring was nonsense. There's an order of things in the world. There's an order of things that is tribal, that is economic, principally tribal and economic and classist. And you know, the elites don't give up power just because people want them to. Money and power runs things. Unifor was terribly committed to social justice until it told Tom McConnell to shut up about the army vehicle sales to Saudi Arabia. You know, the current government has had to pull its horns in on various things since it got in. You know, George Carlin talks about the people who really run the world, and they really do run the world, and we nibble around the edges, but the sad fact is that just because the public wants something doesn't mean the public is going to get something. It may be, there are people who there are genius level people who spend all their time trying to convince the public that they actually do have a choice. Whereas as Ralph Nader says, there's not a dime's worth of difference quite often. Creating the illusion of choice is very important. I mean, Chomsky writes all about that. I think that's probably true. And as for the media, Chomsky also said that the media sees itself as the watchdog of democracy, of the establishment, where it's probably better described as the guard dog of the establishment. There is a complicit order of things, and to dent it or really change it requires a power that I don't think probably exists.
Well, that was refreshingly
Yeah.
optimistic.
How's that for-
Thank you for that.
How's that for happy?
I guess I would only say, I think you touched on something Alan said, which is that I think really all you can do as individuals and as people who are communications professionals is to try and sort of practice it on a small scale. I mean, you just have to get micro about it and say, we have to try and rebuild trust in whatever institution we're representing, which means transparency and an ability and an authenticity in the way you communicate and a forthrightness, which may not seem like it's going to get rewarded, but sometimes is. And probably the Lisiteria thing is the best example of that, where a CEO
Redress,
went forward and
also very
basically
important.
just said, we made it, this is a terrible mistake. We're going to do whatever we can to correct it, and we're going to make sure that the people who've been harmed by it are taken
Oh,
care of.
please don't think that I meant that there's no point in principled behavior, or, there are very, very few really good journalists, and there are probably very few really good, there's very few really good anything. Daniel Patrick Moynihan also said that if you go to a country where the press is reporting nothing but good stories, the chances are there's a lot of good men in jail.
Exactly.
I believe that to be true. So it doesn't negate trying. I'm just saying that the reality is reality, that's all.
Sorry, Mark?
Just to contrast the conversation, I'm just wondering what your views are on GAFA, like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. There's no other companies that are filled with experts, and there seems to be a sense that those companies, there's faith that those companies are going to be able to do things that actually move society forward and help society better, automated cars, all like moonshots. I'm just wondering how that layers into this conversation.
I think that
Well, they will rule the world. I
Yeah.
mean, you got $60 billion on your balance sheet. I mean, and this is going to sound like a non sequitur, but I think you're going to see people who, and you're seeing it already, people who run those large organizations, believing that, guided or misguided, that they have a larger responsibility to the world, and maybe they benefited disproportionate to the effort and the benefit that they have created for the larger world. And I think you're going to start seeing
So we
more
should pay
initiatives
taxes.
like we saw in the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Where you have individuals, Tim Price, buying a newspaper, setting up a ProPublica kind of notion, and actually, so that's wild speculation on my part, but.
That's interesting. The Washington Post is a billionaire's plaything now. Jeff Bezos.
Well,
owns it.
that's
Globe
what
and
it
Mail
always
is
was.
Yeah,
Globe
but
and Mail is a
always was.
billionaire's plaything too.
They always were.
Important people love to have newspapers.
I think it's also, the thing about those companies is that they are, of course, also the biggest collectors of data. So they are the most able to
And now the
read
biggest generator of news.
And
Right.
but that was my point, which is that they're in the business of reading shifts in sentiment, like any people who collect data, and they are now the biggest news. So whether or not you're still on Twitter, Susan, Facebook and Twitter are basically the main news sources for most people under
Twitter,
the age
really?
of. Yeah, people
I
go to
think-
Twitter for news. Now, I'm not saying. They're clicking on.
Yeah,
Well,
I feel a big decline. I was at a meeting with the vice president of Facebook last week. I think the interesting common stream in there, and probably won't articulate this properly, is that those people aren't actually selling a product, they're selling people themselves, right? Like, those companies are only as good as what people themselves contribute to it, right? If people didn't have any faith in Facebook, it wouldn't exist, right? The interesting thing is that they are collectors of people. They're basically empty vessels, right? But they don't. This is the whole disruption argument, right? That Facebook doesn't own a publishing thing. Uber doesn't own any cabs. No, that ownership of property and stuff is not what fuels the next economy. It's ownership of people's data and information about people. And I agree that I think that they are trying to be socially responsible.
We really did have an arrogant stranglehold on things for a long time, though. Remember in
dying.
1988,
You're
after
gonna
the Supreme
pry
Court
your
struck down
fingers
the
off it.
abortion laws, the Parliament convulsed over a new abortion, and there was a committee And there was the usual suspects. There always are. There was the Canadian Abortion Rights Action League. There was REAL women. There were the reporters. There were social justice people. There were academics and students. But the crowd is always the same. And we were all sitting against the wall one time, and Jan Lauder from the Sun said, "Who is that guy over there?" It was just this guy sitting across the room. And who's he with? Well, we don't know. And finally I said, well, just go. I'll go ask him. So I went over to the guy and goes, I'm just here because I'm interested. And I went back and told the reporters, and they went, "Oh, for God's sake." Please, there are experts considering these things. Along you go. You can read about it tomorrow morning.
I have to tell a story about Neil, which I like. He's right that a few of us got to meet Marty Barron, the guy who's the editor featured in Spotlight at dinner over the winter. I didn't like him myself. Sorry. Excuse me.
He's like Leif Schreiber.
Yeah.
He's not, though.
Anyway, what he said was that he really hated reporters who just blah, 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 lament the old days, or nostalgic. You know, what journalism needs right now are not people who just keep talking about how good it used to be. And Neil says to him, "But it was pretty fucking good." And he's right.
Yeah. Says one of the dying elites. Don. And this will have to be the last question, I think. Yeah. You do.
I'm wondering if the emphasis on the word fact here is a little bit misleading. The thing about facts is they're either right or they're wrong. They're true or they're false. They have a clear truth value. And I liked a lot what you were talking about, Nancy, when you talked about climate change. The challenge there is people have very different, you said collections of facts. I wouldn't say that. Lots of times they have a lot of the same facts. They have different theories. And theories are the way that we deal with the world. They let us interpret our facts, project facts for the future, plan for the future, and do what we do. And I guess what I'm thinking here is that we look back over the last 20 or 30 years, and I think, Neil, you were pretty articulate on this, the elites have treated their theories a lot like facts. There's been a whole lot of groupthink around a few theories and how we ought to do stuff that have turned out to be remarkably false and probably not very rewarding for a whole lot of people. And I guess my real question, if it's a question, it's a challenge, is we haven't handled that kind of diversity very well among elites. And if we want people on the other side, people who are not part of the elite, the general public, to be more reflective about their facts and ultimately what they think, and to make judgments on whether this is a reasonably good theory, more fine-grained judgments, then we have to be able to do that at a higher level. So my challenge, I think, to the elites is to stop thinking with groupthink and stop treating theories like facts and ask ourselves how we become more diverse in our conversations at that level and welcome that kind of discussion.
There are very few, the legal term stipulate, let's stipulate this. There's very few stipulatable facts. There are few you know, my favorite headline is the Onion headline. Remember, Jacques Derrida dies. You know, you know, and that is actually the reason for the is it a chicken or not a chicken thing that goes back to that the old media used to have. But it's a valid question, right? Quite often things that we see as we report breathlessly as fact turn out not to be that at all. And I think that probably reporters would, there should be a very small number of things that we stipulate as true, but those things should be stipulated. They shouldn't, those things are objectively true.
I think that if there, and God forgive me if there is anyone here from the Department of Finance, having spent many years doing work for the Department of Finance, but I think the problem is exactly what you're pointing to, though, Don, which is that my stipulated fact about what the GDP is,
right, exactly,
may or may not be true. So, I mean, this is the problem with the sort of facts that they are, and that's why I say there are people who have sets of facts. I mean, there might be some indisputable facts about climate change that I would hope we could all sort of find a consensus on. But it's also true that if you're a public that for years has been kind of told a set of facts and then told, actually, you know what we said the budget deficit was for last year? We told you that was a fact. Actually, it was actually like $3 billion more. So, but that's a fact now. So trust us when we tell you that's a fact now. It really is $3 billion more than we said. And it becomes this kind of endless cycle where there's, to Neil's point, there are very, very, very few facts that can actually be stipulated. And I think that's a function of, you know, what we've been talking about, a failure of elites to actually be transparent for their own political or corporate or private interests, a lack of faith in institutions. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not as cynical as Neil.
No one is.
No, I was about to say. No one is. But I'm also, I think it really becomes a kind of responsibility on the part of individual citizens and institutions to say we have to do a better job. We actually just have to start telling the truth. That's my view. Anybody else?
No, that's good.
One last question before we hit the bar.
Okay. This is changing the topic a little bit, but since you mentioned think tanks a lot as a source of information for the world, I'm curious what's the difference between Canada and the U.S. when it comes to that, particularly their sources of funding and the level of influence they have, both on public discourse and elections.
In America, the think tanks for a long time were center left, and then along came the Adolph Coors and various other Republican billionaires who decided we need to create an ideas factory that is, and the culmination of that was Fox News, but the Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, American Enterprise Institute, those were all created deliberately to sow conservative ideas, and in some cases, great, right? The thing is that as I said earlier, the person who's going to get on, and all of them compete for media time. That's why you see them on TV, because they have to report at the end of the month how many TV minutes and newspaper column inches they've had. But we go for the ones that are the most fluent talkers and the most convincing, not necessarily the most knowledgeable ones. And they tend to hire people who are at least as much public relations people as they are public policy or factual geniuses. There's a place called the Peterson Institute in the United States that is a specialist on public debt. You don't see an awful lot of those people on TV because those people talk in extremely abstruse terms and they're incredibly well educated, and that's where Christine Lagarde goes, and that's where foreign leaders go to talk about debt. But it's not interesting to the public. Norm Ornstein does very well because Norm Ornstein talks like a genius.
Well, and he's been there for 30 years.
And he's a lefty
Yeah.
as well at AEI, which is rare. But you know, it's sponsorship, money, column inches, and minutes, and we're complicit in it. But I try to just find smart people, you know, which is a subjective thing to do.
But if you have enough think tanks and enough think tanks of opposing points of view, that's a good thing for democracy, because you got alternative kind of ideas coming up. I mean, it's also, and Canada is just now starting to get into the think tank business. I mean, for decades and decades, we had the C.T. Howe Institute and Fraser Institute, and that was about it.
Yeah.
But you know, someone once said that, you know, if you're an American, the best and the brightest, the absolute best career for you would include a stint in academe, a stint in journalism, a stint in business, and a stint in government. And then in Canada, if you do any one of those things, you're disqualified from doing the other three.
Exactly.
And that's not so far from the truth. And one of the reasons the difference was because the American system allowed exceptional people who were in business to take a year off and spend in a think tank, steeping themselves in public policy, and then they'd go into government. And so I don't think there's anything inherently evil about think tanks. And plus, you know, from what I know about the Canadian business sector, is that they're too kind of slothful and disinterested to actually put any real money behind thought. So.
I think that might change with fundraising restrictions, or?
Even then, I mean, the amounts they put in is so paltry compared to what American corporations pay for lobbyists and PACs, and it's just an entirely different universe.
Before I start, I'd like to thank the panelists. It was a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion. I appreciate their insights. In terms of the content, one of the key themes throughout the discussion was the rejection of facts and the absence of agreed-upon set of facts, and also a rejection of expertise. And that's a really important component of a much larger trend. And at Environics, we've been studying the social values of Canadians since the 80s. And one of the most pronounced trends we see in those data is a decline in deference to authority. So that can be a decline in deference within the family, it can be in a religious context, it can be in the workplace with a questioning of hierarchy, and it can also be in the governmental and political sense. So One of the outcomes of this decline in deference to authority is a real desire on the part of many Canadians to have a voice, to have a say in important decisions that they think affect their lives. So at a practical level, this means that taxpayers, for example, or users of services such as healthcare or daycare, feel like they have practical experience and practical expertise to share, and they want to have a say in those important decisions. A second point I found interesting in the debate, in most debates that we have, there's a vocal, active group on each side of the issue. But those are usually pretty small proportions of the population, so what that leaves is a silent majority. And silent majority is important. It's not that they don't care or they don't have attitudes and opinions, they're just less engaged, less vocal, they might be busy with their day-to-day lives. So it could be that one resolution to the authenticity paradox is to find creative ways to give voice to the silent majority. That might be through public engagement and consultation or other means. But the big idea is find opportunities to engage that silent majority and give them an opportunity to speak their minds on the issues they care about.
So what's gone on here, I think, is we had a lot of talk in the second half of the 20th century about the emergence of a new class of knowledge workers. This was a post-industrial society. Human capital was going to supplant conventional capital as the new dominant organizing principle of how economies would be run and who would move forward and who would not. This struggle between the technocrats or the human capital theorists and the conventional capital proponents has clearly been lost to the conventional capital. Whatever the arguments were, and those who had higher human capital certainty did better, but nowhere nearly as well as those at the top who were securing rent and investment income and so on and so forth. So that struggle really is one that has been surrendered to this point in time to the conventional capital, property, rent, all of those income, those kinds of things. But also to the degree that this is also linked to a period of protracted economic stagnation, and the evidence is increasingly clear that the economy of upper North America just isn't working the way it did in the last half of the 20th century. This has been something which has produced a rise in what some have called an authoritarian outlook, a closed mind, a more ordered mind. It's been fertile ground for the support of those who voted to leave Brexit, for Donald Trump supporters in the United States, and it's also a force in Canada as well, albeit somewhat more muted. But this is an outlook which eschews rationality in favor of moral certainty, and obviously the expert is seen as part of the problem in that different outlook. So that's something to be wary of as well.
If you look at the data, and we've done a number of surveys looking at how Canadians access news and how the information they get impacts their opinions, one of the most fascinating questions we ask is, if a major news event happened, where would you first hear about it? And what we see is a big generational gap. So those under the age of 35, we find that Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, social media platforms are top on the list. TV, news websites come well back. Among those over 35, those more traditional platforms like television, radio, newspapers remain dominant. And so we're seeing a transition from one in which we had a number of dominant news sources that we sort of count on and seek out, to one in which news information gathering is far more passive. We only see what people share. We only see what often we agree with or that align with our own values. And so this kind of micro crowdsourcing of information is impacting the decisions we make. And I'll make one more point that I think is important. Think about the consumer market and the impact of reviews and recommendations and the fact that experts like movie critics or restaurant critics no longer really have the influence they once did. The same is true in the political world. So we look to what others who are like us think about our political leaders, and the momentum that builds behind these candidates is driven by the voices that we see on Facebook, on Twitter, and elsewhere, and less about what political analysts or academics or professors who study the policies or politics really do say about these issues.